So the first thing I should talk about, step one, is which register is right for you. So what I intend to do now is give you a very brief delineation of the registers, provide some sort of context. So a registered science technician is not a rookie. It's typically someone with about a year's experience, so they can work with minimal supervision, delivering essential scientific services, but they may not be expected in the context of this report to actually troubleshoot or work independently or work up a new method, okay? As a corollary to that, given that they're competent independently at the bench, but dependent on a supervisor to direct their work, they're not necessarily involved in actual training or supervision of other staff. If we compare that with a registered scientist is like an RSI tech, but typically has 2 years experience. And the seminal difference between the two is a registered scientist would be expected to actually improvise or troubleshoot on a standard SOP and not necessarily require conferring with someone at a higher position, okay? And the only other point I'll make in relation to registered scientists is the fact that by virtue of that extra experience in the lab, they would normally also train and perhaps train, I should say, people in the context of both standard operating procedures, such as actually registered science technicians or completely new beginners, and also associated health and safety, COSH. If we now go to chartered scientist essentially is a slightly different beast to RSI Tech and RSI. RSI, I always think of being an extension of RSI Tech, whereas a chartered scientist is something a little bit more demanding, okay? Chartered scientist typically is somebody that does at least some of the above, but they also have additional and autonomous, or should I say, separate responsibilities, such as financial budgeting. They might be responsible for a small consumables account in their office or lab. They're probably managing multiple projects, and they may, in fact, work up those projects and associated equipment from scratch with obviously the approval of the academic in the lab. So a slightly more demanding role. I will say one thing at the outset. It is about what you do in the lab and not actually your job description, okay? So a chartered scientist doesn't necessarily have to be a line manager. They can be, but it's not exclusively line managers. If somebody, for example, is actually bench supervising somebody in a lab or in an office where they're training them, but in addition, actually looking at the output of what they do and making suggestions as to how they take things forward, clearly that's a more supervisory role, okay? Unlike RSI, where they train and then walk away. So in that sense, they are managing a project, and it's that bench supervision or management, if they're not a line manager, that qualifies them, makes them eligible to apply for chartered scientist. And just to recap, an RSI tech is somebody with 1 year's experience. They can work autonomously. A CSI is somebody with 5 years experience. And an RSI is somebody who is able to problem solve a little bit more than an RSI tech. So correspondingly, they would have a minimum of 2 years experience. Of course, associated with those registers is a level of performance. So if we look at these levels here, we can see that an RSI tech typically works to level 3 or 4, and I'll sort of come on to what that is in a minute. They can demonstrate through their competency report that they're working at level 3 or 4. Correspondingly, RSI is level 5 or 6, and finally, a CSI is level 7 or 8. So let me put some substance on those delineations. So level 3 or 4 is synonymous traditionally with A levels, but or HNCs under the old apprenticeships, but increasingly it's also associated with T levels and new apprenticeships. Level 5 or 6 traditionally were an HND, which is 2 years of a degree, level 5, or a fully fledged 3-year degree, level 6. But increasingly, with the inception of the apprentice levy, it can actually mean somebody who is actually working towards a higher apprenticeship as well. And then finally, most CSIs have to demonstrate, in fact, all CSIs have to demonstrate that they're working to at least a master's. One thing I'll do actually before I come off this slide is just say that it is actually demonstration of the ability to work at that level that is paramount. And by that, I mean, it doesn't matter if you don't have the formal qualifications enunciated here, as long as you can demonstrate through your reflective practice in your competency report that you're meeting responsibilities and associated knowledge and behavior at these levels, that is sufficient. That said, let me add one caveat before I move on. If you don't have the formal qualifications, it's now necessary under a new Science Council ruling for you to complete something called an equivalent report in addition to the standard competency report. And details of that can be found on the Science Council website, and I'll say no more.